everyone. Welcome to our first budget workshop for 21-22. My name is Karen Redman. I'm the Mayor of the town of Gawler. I'll be chairing this workshop. However, I won't be leading it. Staff will be leading the workshop. Firstly, I'd like to welcome everyone who's here. We have some independent audit committee members. We have Natalie Johnston. Welcome, Natalie. Peter Fairley-Jones has just walked in. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for coming and assisting us with this workshop. It's always good to see independent here engaging in what is a really important process. Anybody who's watching on live on YouTube, welcome. Hope you enjoy the workshop session as well. I'd like to welcome staff. We have a number of staff, senior staff here. David Petrozola, who's been integral in the development of the workshop materials, particularly the big sheets, and really a lot of work, David. Well done on that. And we'll be looking at those strategic planning sheets under the headings of our community plan, which I think is really exciting about how we budget and how we plan for the future. So that's a bit of a work in progress, but well done, David, on all the work that you've done there. Thank you to staff, Henry Innett, our CEO, Lakesh, who's acting head of finance. We have Paul Horwood here, who's assisting. Hello, Paul, welcome. And welcome to Sam, Jack and Chia. And David, of course, is the IT guru and doing everything. And he's also setting up the Santa's workshop, and he's in red. So I'm thinking he's Santa. Anyway. So yeah, the Santa's workshop is being set up next door. So that's very exciting as well. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on Kaurna land this evening. Of course, it's the traditional lands for the Kaurna people. We respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. So just some housekeeping and some statements around process. This workshop session has been convened for the purpose of setting the scene for the long-term financial plan, rating strategy, budget framework, and to brief council members and our community on issues relating to their decision-making function. This session will be used solely for the purpose of information sharing and not for the purpose of debating issues, building consensus positions, or otherwise discharging council's deliberative and decision-making functions. We don't have anybody from the community who are here face-to-face, so I won't read out that paragraph. We don't have an agenda, and we don't take minutes for these workshop sessions. They are informal. To limit disruption to the session, I'd ask everyone to turn their phone off or to silent. And if you need to take a phone call, please take it outside, because it's quite disrespectful if you're on the phone during a workshop. So please take that outside. Basic housekeeping, bathrooms are just out in the corridor. Exit signs, if there's a disaster, we'll follow the CEO and he'll guide us out to safety. There is no requirement, I don't believe, to go into confidence, so I don't think there's any requirement. Henry, you've not determined that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so there's no requirement, as far as I'm aware, to go into confidence, so this will be a public workshop. So, without further ado, I think I have to hand over to Henry Innett, the CEO, who's going to take us down there. How will people who are live stream be able to watch if we do that, Henry?
People won't be able to see the screens, but they'll be able to hear. We'll turn the microphones on at the end of the table, and they'll be able to hear the conversation, but they won't be able to see the screens.
How will they hear that?
Well, we'll move the microphone closer to where the conversation might be. We'll only be up there for a few minutes.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. That's okay. Thank you. Okay, so I'll hand over to you, Henry, and you can just walk us through. Thank you.
So, yeah, if the members could indulge me and members of the independent members of the audit committee, audit risk committee, can indulge me for a few minutes and leave your desk and walk up to the large posters in the back of the room. Then I'll just walk through and have a bit of a conversation about what what we've been working on behind the scenes for the last couple of months to set the context relative to the long-term financial plan deliberation. So again, if you can just indulge me, I think it'll only be about 5 or 10 minutes, but I think it's an important sort of start to the discussion.
I forgot to say apologies. So we do have some apologies from Councillor Shanks, Councillor Little, Councillor Goldstone is not feeling well, and I think that's it. So I do apologise for those for that oversight. Sorry, Henry. So we're going down there.
Sort of failed. So the staff, in leading up to deliberations on the 22-23 budget and the long-term financial plan refresh, we turned our mind to the community plan. And you know, everyone knows the community plan is our most strategic document. Important reference point in our decisions, not only relative to micro decisions, but macro decisions. So all this information is effectively in the current community plan, it's in the long-term financial plan, and to varying degrees within our initial thinking about the 22-23 budget. All of this is still work in progress and is very much will be informed by the conversation today. And I'm hoping that some of you may be interested enough for us to get copies of this document, these documents, and we'll give them to you as a Christmas gift. It's very difficult to replicate this on an A3 size or even electronically. So we will tie a bow around them and distribute them accordingly.
Christmas reading, and I.
Christmas reading. So it's structured on the community plan. It references what happened last year and where we're at today, and then where we're at next year. And the focus of this is, I was just demonstrating this today a few minutes ago, that as we know, when we look at 22-23, we're not looking at 22-23, but it's very much this context. And when you step back and look at what we do, there's a lot of important recurrent initiatives. But equally it demonstrates there's only a handful, at least at this high level, that have a landing date. Now, these dates can be a bit fluid, but this is showing, for example, that we're looking at delivering on the next iconic project being the Aquatic Centre between the 27-29 year. We're looking at the issue of whether Concordia lands, which is going to be a significant sort of threshold point in Barossa, and we've roughly estimated 24-25 now. That may not eventuate, it's very fluid. We then have anticipated boundary reform, but we prepared this up to last week, and there's some correspondence that might indicate that's going to be delayed potentially. And then the rural areas investigation, depending on where we're at the current investigations, there's potential land impact there. When we get to the goal 3, which is the critical path, and we talk about the next iconic project, which is the Aquatic Centre, we have Cardiff and we have SSR. Now, part of the scenarios that we're going to be talking through the presentation at the moment effectively presents 2 scenarios. The first scenario is seeking to deliver the Aquatic Centre as per business as normal relative to what we've been doing over the last couple of years, which is a capital works program, a discretionary capital spend of $5 or $6 million. Now, what scenario 1 tells us is that if we do that, we're going to be in deficits for the next 8 years. Scenario 2, though, is predicated on the pre-COVID deliberations that Council was making about reducing our expenditure, creating capacity to then deliver on the iconic project. And that iteration of, or scenario 2, presents that of the next 8 to 10 years, it's 2 or 3 years of deficits rather than the 8 or 10. So again, it's not new information, but presenting it in a different format, visualising it differently, encouraging different conversations that we particularly had at the executive level, and depending on how it goes through with yourselves, not only today, but then when we might revisit this in the new year, and equally having conversations with staff throughout the organisation for them to get another sense, and I think a more of an important, tangible sense about everyone's contribution to the community plan and how many of these projects are interrelated and they don't exist in isolation, although they might sit in a box, they certainly, influence one another at a whole number of different levels. And I think one of the many important messages is that again, you'll see this is all consistent. Well, this is all the activation strategy that we are involved with, and it demonstrates that any given year we're spending around $230,000, $250,000. And if this were to be otherwise sort of made public, which I'm sure it would at some time, it just demonstrates to the community that's such a critical part of council's function. It's not the big 20 million project, but it's, we get as much value out of these sort of activities as we do with the roads and the footpaths and the civic centre and then the aquatic centre redevelopment. So that was really just setting the context. Again, there is a lot of detail here, but this is where we need to demonstrate how we do the business, where we spend the money, and what are the priorities.
Can we have a look?
Yes, so please have a look. You've got a texter. You might have some thoughts. Henry, don't hesitate.
What's the role of a texter?
Well, if you're looking at something and you don't agree with something, or you think that something's missing, and that may not be possible now, but we will provide these to you in hard copy, so you can then use the texter thereafter. So, David?
Yeah, I mean, in some areas there's duplication with some numbers and things like that. I think it's more the intent of the programs continuing rather than some of the dollar figures. So I don't think we should get hung up on the dollar sort of values. It's more the intent of those programs.
Yes, and these
thinking things like the cameras for $30,000 each year that Cody sort of pointed out to me. That's maybe something that we change around and do something differently with later, but it's still that IT, maybe looking sort of projects for the main street in that area, or security for our town and stuff like that in that area. But there may be some comments written there, but I just think, not to get too hung up with it. It's more about the long-term 10-year planning thing, which I think is so important, because we do get bogged down in that 12 months and not the 5, 10 years and longer. So I think this is really good.
Paul? So, Mayor and Henry, if I can just comment two things further to what you just mentioned, Dave. The thing I wanted to point out was, yes, there are dollar values, indicative dollar values attached to all them. Yeah. But if you add them all together, we can't afford to do.
No,
that's right. This is very much aspirational.
Yeah.
But it's got to be clear that in the long-term financial plan, we clearly can't afford to do everything. No. And further to what Henry said in terms of scenario 2, which we'll talk through shortly, in terms of when you're saying reducing expenditure, that's reducing discretionary capital. Yeah. Because not operating, certainly yes, we will always continue to look at operating, but the key focus in that scenario is reducing that discretionary capital investment to then get debt down.
So when you say capital investment, are you talking about new capital, or you
just new and replacement? Yeah, because that's where we've continually said we don't want to touch. We're recommending to not sort of touch replacement renewal. Because we need to have that appropriate reinvestment in our existing assets, so that we don't deliver an infrastructure backlog. And there we've been good in that the last 5 years. We had a ratio result of less than 97%. So that's been very.
So you're talking about new capital.
Correct.
Yes. New stuff.
Because bear in mind, the key thing with new projects is that's where you have the sting in the tail at the end of the project with new depreciation, new maintenance.
Now the other thing is we've got some grants in for 3 changing rooms and the netball courts.
Yes.
And that's in our plan, and it's in the stuff. What happens if they don't get up? What do we do then? Because we've got money allocated to 50%, haven't we, for those 4 projects?
Yeah, so for 22, 23, years, right? Yes, both models are predicated on the existing grant applications being successful.
Yes, yeah.
So
yeah.
if they're not successful, then we've got to come back to council and have a rethink in terms of, well, what
We reallocate the money or do something else.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so if we are successful in those grants, correct me if I'm right, Paul, that's effectively the total amount of our new capital for 22-23.
So 5 million.
Yeah.
No,
That's a couple.
well, it depends on which scenario you're looking at.
Yeah.
So basically, we need to pull our reins in and say, you know, there's this grant coming out, that would be fantastic for that, but no, we can't do it because
Yes,
we've got to get our.
Longer term.
Well, so I think the key thing is, and I think members are appreciative of this already, is that any major project, before we sign any commitment to it, council needs to consider the longer term financial consequences and what that all means. So not looking at 1 year in isolation, but in the longer term.
And also little tiny things add up, you know.
Yes.
We've always taught in business that it's not the big things because you've planned for that, it's the petty cash basically that mounts up, and before you know it, you've got yourself into massive debt. So that's what you've got to look at.
Yeah, I mean, like for me, it's sort of like, you know, you do an iconic project, but you take some debt in, then you get your debt down, and you think about it again. For me, it's that sine wave, really.
Yes.
Yeah, which is probably option 2 for me.
And
but, yeah.
Paul, in your time in council, you would recall that
Yes.
that's what actually we did there
Yeah, we just this
from
sine
about
wave.
2009, certainly when I started, we were
There,
liabilities ratio was up here.
we got it down,
here.
borrowed some money for this, and then we're up here, now we need to get it down again, so we get the pool and whatever. So it's that sine wave.
And our operating.
Sustainability is that one.
Yes, in 1 year, yes.
Yeah.
And as we know, we're judged every year on the budget that we strike.
Yeah.
And the, you know, the ratios, the sustainability ratios. And we always, you know, the goal is to have, you know, within a context of an 8 to 10 year cycle, balanced positions. We might have surplus positions. Invariably, we avoid deficits where we can, but, you know, as Paul was mentioned, and that's not a bad word, but we certainly need to manage it. But we are judged on those sustainability ratios, and it's forever making sure that, again, we make those decisions.
So with the deficits, there's a high, 1 year there's a really high deficit, but there's a reason for that.
Yes.
And that's the federal government funding.
Yes.
We're not sure whether that will continue. That's the
Yeah.
cut-off point. Is that right?
Yes, so in 23, 24, in both scenarios, the recurrent grant funding is affected because for that year, the roads to recovery allocation for that year, the federal government as a stimulus package paid us 2 years worth back in 1920. So our 23, 24 allocation was paid then. Similarly, the other one is the federal government a couple of years ago announced supplementary local road funding for 2 years. That finishes in 22, 23. That's about 160,000. The roads recovery is about 320,000. And the other one there is the LRCIP, Local Roads
Community
Infrastructure
Yeah.
Program. We've provided funding from that will relate to 22, 23. Now, there might be a new program that comes out at a federal level. We don't know, but until we know that, we haven't allocated it.
So certainly the national local government, when I was on the ALGA board, they were really strong in advocating for that to continue. South Australia is the only state that gets a supplementary road funding, it's really disadvantaged compared to the rest of Australia. So we've been able to put up arguments to get that funding. But that's a year by year, or, you know, they don't automatically just roll it over. So there's always advocacy that needs to happen. So we all need to get on board to get that money because it makes a big difference to us.
And bear in mind there, that impact for us is 23, 24. Virtually every other council in state will be impacted
That's right.
at a similar level.
Yeah.
So it's not just us in isolation.
Sometimes it falls
It's
early and
explained
sometimes it falls late in the financial year as well, which misses the finances up.
Oh, yeah.
Also, so we keep the same rate in the dollar, aren't we? So it's predicated on keeping the same rate.
Well, the actual rate per dollar will fluctuate based on valuation.
Yeah, it will,
But in
but-
terms of the percentage increase.
Yes, there, yeah, I'm just sort of,
Yes.
but we'll keep the rate per dollar the same, or that'll go up and down,
I guess
depending on growth,
That will,
on the valuation of houses that have a 2.5% increase.
yes, that may fluctuate.
Okay.
So if valuations were materially to go up across the board,
And the rate per dollar
then the
come
rate per
down.
dollar will
Okay,
come
I
down.
wasn't too sure when I read the.
So Light Council didn't change their rate of
Yes.
dollar, so they got a windfall, how many percent?
3.85.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
about
yeah,
5% increase in
yeah,
that.
because you got the rate per dollar, then you've got the
Yeah, they
two.
get those rates.
Yeah, but, okay, so it's a predicated that will go,
Yes,
it floats around with the valuations, right?
Yeah.
yes, because the mayor's right in terms of Light and a couple of other councils. I think if it sneakily was saying
So the free-
they were freezing their rate per dollar,
Yeah,
to me, the average punter would think, oh, well, my rates are
yeah,
being
yeah,
frozen, but that's not the reality,
yes.
particularly if there's valuation movement. So
It sounds like a free card trick to me, but anyway, that's the way it is.
So again, that was just wanting to set the scene and demonstrating the further work that the administration have done in terms of looking at the community plan differently, informing the two scenarios that we're about to go through in a bit more detail. We will get these copied to you and send them out. So
I think it'd be good for us to just have a quick look.
yeah,
Just so we
sure,
can
absolutely.
Understand
Yep,
what
yep.
some of the detail, and something might jump out at us.
Yep.
We do have texts.
Use the texters. If anything particular sort of jumps out, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So they're all done in themes of the community
As per the
plan.
community plan.
but,
And
yeah.
as members know, hopefully, that each theme has some key actions, key projects. And that's what we're focused on.
So the boundary reform, so we're going to have the boundary reform the same year as we get Concordia, is it?
Well, that's how we've thought of it, yes.
On the same,
Now,
same year.
Now, that may not eventuate. This is all very fluid.
Yeah.
Um,
Correct.
And, state government haven't even made an announcement about Concordia and, if,
Well, I think
there
it's
is a
a
rumour floating around that Concordia is not going to happen, relative to the next iteration of the 30-year plan.
There's no need. Yeah,
In terms of
you've got River Lee and all that
That's
sort of
right,
stuff.
that's right. So that may well be kicked out beyond the 30-year cycle.
Yeah, well, I can't believe they're going to do it when you've got River Lee. But that's going to sit there and see anyway.
Is that right, Henry?
Sorry, what's that, Don?
Venus sort of said.
Yes. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, but the developers are saying, or at least the developers for Concordia are saying, well, no, that's a point difference, it's a different market. Well, different market.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I know that all the places of land have got such a struggle to get good infrastructure. You release something like that, it just source of money.
That's right.
excuses.
So that'd be interesting to push back on the plan.
Well,
Miss Springwood's a long way to go. That's sort of many years.
It's still flat in the ground. And every time you look around, there's. This form up there.
And then you go, yeah, all the way out to.
All of that's all the There are some people that replacement. It's not very often.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that'd be interesting. Yeah.
But this is.
Is this something that we're sharing with the entire?
It's all planned, you don't cut it. Read it, yeah.
It's a lot of stuff. A lot of people don't realise what council does.
That's what yeah, that's why we shifted the road. Because you read the community plan, oh, you're right. Can't visualise it all in your head. You don't know what to take off. You read one of them, oh, you're right.
Right. We
That's township stuff, and this is the grove stuff. Yeah, so they're all different.
Okay. Going through this sort of stuff.
How are we going? We are in the finance side of things. I like this one. Yeah, I'm on it. Oh, yeah.
Good reason. I mean, that's a good reason. At least
And some of these are, like the mentions these several times, but I'm not sure if it's probably plain thing. Yeah, the subscription. Yeah, like, you know. Maybe it's just like, just getting charged. Some of the costs that comes in here, it's just, you can't avoid that.
Really different. It's just fix it.
So most of these are recon because these are like backwards, you know, like financial and we can see customer service, customer improvements, they are like almost. This has the same thing. This one's the same as this one.
We just had a new one.
Which one? Software license here and here. It's the same. Different sections. This is for software and this would be like this would be for the Civica, like the software that we use in finance. This one is for economic development, software.
Just to.
That's sort of.
Oh, yeah. Good. Lot of things to do, isn't it? Yes. Oh, that's, 2026, 27.
You don't get the funny part.
No, I know. It's gonna be the mayor.
There's certain times where I just forget stuff. Would want to say something and the words won't come out. But the doctors used to say
I said with them, came up with 3 current things. That's right.
I just assume when I started, it was big one that shopping says.
if we don't take one license Absolutely. And that, like I discussed, that's why I want to see that. That's absolutely. Yeah. That's all. Yeah, it's good though. There's a lot there. Certainly makes it there. There's a lot of free things. I keep seeing things we've added on and going, oh. but the community wanted them, so we've delivered them.
Yeah, and it's a lot of stuff, like in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of stuff delivered from the community. A lot of progress.
Because they keep them all together. A lot of people think that if all these malls and all that, they've only got one way, it doesn't work that way. A lot of them have gone back to other. Yes, yeah, that's a bit of a myth. The only time a mall works is when it's a mall.
We're back. That was great. What do people think of that? Anybody want to make any comments about spatial planning boards?
As I say, members, we'll have a hard copy sent out to you leading up to the end of next week.
Okay, so what's next, Henry? Is it Lakesh? Over to Paul and Lakesh. Okay, over to you guys.
Thank you, Mayor Karen and members. Yes, Lakesh and I will sort of do a bit of tag team through the session. Just on the screen there, we've obviously forwarded through the copy of the presentation and the two scenarios to you last week to have a advanced look at, but on that screen we've got the discussion topics outlined, which we'll go through in sequence with you tonight. And Mayor, this presentation very much sort of modelled around previous years' sessions with this first workshop, very much sort of setting the scene and framework for future conversations that will happen in the new calendar year. Should we just go to the next one? And this slide here is just really illustrating graphically how a lot of the suite of our key planning documents, one being the budget, but how all our key strategic documents do sort of talk to each other and inform each other. So from I guess, a purely financial setting, the key documents are the long-term financial plan and the long-term asset management plans. And under the Local Government Act's members, the long-term financial plan does actually have to be informed by the asset management plan. The two have to be in alignment. But there will obviously be other key sort of strategic planning documents to inform the budget process each year. And I guess the key purpose of the long-term financial plan, and one of the key factors why we're sort of talking about that at the outset of this conversation, is such that we're really trying to sort of set the scene, framework, context for the 22-23 budget, such that when you go in to have conversations about the 22-23 budget, we can have those conversations in the context of a long-term financial plan and what the impact of 22-23 decisions might be, not just on 22-23, but also in the longer term. So it's very much just trying to provide that contextual graphic, if you like. And then in relation to the critical path, obviously what's presented on the screens tonight. Henry or David, did you want to speak further to that? Yeah, okay.
So thank you. So I'll take turn from here. So then we have got 2022-23 budget, some of the influencing factors that what are the external or internal factors which determine that how the budget is going to be made. So that includes scholar community plan, long-term financial plan, asset management plan. If there is any change in the policies in regards to the budget management, treasury management, or strategic rating, anything with council resolutions. So if there are past resolution where the money needs to be set aside, that's also going to determine how the budget is going to be set for 2022-23. The salaries and wages, especially like enterprise bargaining agreement. So based on that, if there is something already preset for salaries and wages increase, that's going to be factored in 2022-23 budget. Increase in unit rates of materials. So if the cost of material is getting expensive, that's going to affect the capital projects and even like operational, some of the projects. So that is also going to be determining 22-23 budget. COVID-19, like how there may be some money in the market, or if that's a factor that affects our income, mostly our civic center is closed or temporarily not operational, that's going to affect our income. Federal and state budgets or legislation, how the federal budget is allocated, the money that local government gets through it. Triple bottom line, so environmental factors, water consumption, and some of the financial factors. So, and also like next year there is elections as well. So that's going to determine another factor which we did miss here. So that's going to be the influencing factors for next year. The next slide is on
Lakesh, with the increase in unit rates of materials, we've got a contingency as part of the budget, part of each capital budget. How is that implemented? And can we move that up and down a little bit if we feel there's a need to do that or not?
Certainly we can do that. We can increase our contingency, but the contingency is mostly like to cover for any unknown circumstances within a project. But if we know from the start that the cost of material has gone up, so that we still need to have some contingency in the budget. But what it's going to mean is that, say, for example, like a building was to be constructed by 100,000, but because the unit rates have increased, the costing of that is now 130,000. So that's going to impact our depreciation as well, because the capitalized value is going to be more. So in that sense, yep. So Sam can add some.
I suppose that's at the looking at each year in isolation. We've got a $300 million asset base. We know that unit rates are currently skyrocketing. We're getting advice, pretty much weekly from different suppliers of our unit rates. So the next iteration of our the next asset revaluation that we're going to take is going to have, I'm flagging material depreciation increase at material because of the quantum of increase in steel and raw materials, timber, as well as general labour market increases. So that's just something that we can't quantify at this point, but we know it's coming.
Thanks, Sam. So the next slide is based on the town of Gawler by the numbers. So that generally speaks, just to remind everyone how currently the budget is sitting. So 2021-22 operating budget, 34 million of operating income. The estimated surplus is about 145,000 based on the first quarter budget review. We have got a 330 million asset base, forecasted debt of 25.36 million as at 30th of June 2022, 15.93 million of capital expenses. We are projecting an annual growth of 2% and the budgeted staff FTE of 130 or 12.4 million of operational salaries. So that's basically telling that where council is sitting currently. And what we are presenting to you is how the council is going to look in the next 10 years and focusing on the next year budget from there. The next slide talks about rating information for other councils. So we did a small comparison for other councils nearby and like in our range with income and budget. So if we see Barossa Council about 2.75, Light Regional Council no more than 2.5%, Playford 2.48, Victor Harbour 2%, Mount Barker 1% above the CPI. So that's the sort of range that everyone is targeting. And with town of Gawler, with our scenarios, we have based our scenarios on 2.5% rates increase. So that's very much in line with what other councils are using. Is there any questions so far? No, all good, thank you. Then we move to the scenarios. So I'll hand over to Paul in that respect.
Thanks, Lakesh. So Mayor and members, what we've presenting to you tonight is two scenarios for you to sort of digest and consider. And on the screen, what we've endeavoured to explain is the difference between the two. So in that regard, scenario one is predicated on the existing adopted long-term financial plan that was adopted as part of the 21-22 budget adoption. And what we've done there, Mayor, is we've simply, since that time, we've updated the plan with the 2021 final audited results, also updated it with the 21-22 first quarter budget review estimates. And as I've indicated in the text under the please note, with both scenarios, we've endeavoured to review the embedded operational income and expenditure assumptions couched in the plan. And in that regard, based on historic trends, for example, we've increased the provision for revenue from development applications and cemetery fees. I stress that that's only relatively marginal dollars, but from a DA's perspective, do need to stress that's based on pre-COVID trends. So we're not expecting the current sort of level of that development to necessarily continue in coming years. As we have discussed before, down the back with just explaining the second bullet point there, the both models are predicated on and demonstrating what the financial outcomes would be if the existing grant applications in the system do eventuate. So in that regard, the three key ones are the modular sporting change rooms, Essex Park, Netball Courts and Carpethan Reserve. as we've touched on, both the scenarios do provide for some operating deficits over the life of the plan. Scenario 1 has for 7 of the 10 years and scenario 2 for 3 years. So again, scenario 1 is purely predicated on updating the existing plan. However, with scenario 2, what we've the modelling we've done there is very much based on where we were immediately pre-COVID. You might recall we were virtually just about ready to jump to that position of debt reduction through reducing capital expenditure. Then sort of COVID hit and everything went a bit topsy-turvy. But scenario 2 is predicated very much getting back in that space. And with the two scenarios, in terms of the graphs with the 10-year snapshots, it's important to note that from operationally, the total operational income with both models is exactly the same. And then similarly from an expenditure level, the employee costs and materials contracts and other expenses is exactly the same as well under both scenarios. The key difference comes down to depreciation and finance costs. And those are influenced by the fact that scenario 1 has extensively more capital investment, and that's solely relative to new and upgraded assets, which we'll go through shortly. And the immediate consequence of that, members, is that the flow-on effect on new depreciation, but also increased borrowing amounts, which automatically leads to increased finance costs. So it's only the finance costs and depreciation that are changing with each of the models. And as you would have seen, there is quite a significant difference between the two operationally, just because of that depreciation and finance costs effect. We do also recognise that again, touching on the fact that both scenarios do have, scenario 2, for example, has a couple of years of deficits. As we've touched on 23-24, with the adjustment with the grant funding, yes, that's a sort of 1-year aberration, so to speak. But with scenario 2, outside of that year, there's a indicative deficit of 463,000 in 24-25, and then a indicative 305,000 deficit in 29-30. But when you look at those deficit amounts for those two years compared to our total operating revenue, which is our operating ratio, it's a relatively very small amount in the order of less than 1% or slightly higher.
Yeah, I just want to be clear, the scenario 1 is more capital, and scenario 2 isn't. But are we maintaining our assets and we're keeping on top of the asset renewal ratio?
Yes, yeah, to be clear in that regard, the difference between the two is purely in relation to new and upgraded assets. So we're clear on the fact that both scenarios have exactly the same dollars in relation to asset replacement and renewal, as informed by our current asset management plans, which are in the process of being updated. So those figures may change slightly, but the message, Mayor, we've said for a number of years is the recommendation to Council is to maintain that asset sustainability ratio, because whilst we have previously said, yes, a council could decide if they wanted to reduce that for 1 or 2 years, which may be fine if they want to do that. But professionally, I wouldn't recommend that because you do want to be maintaining your existing asset base, whether it be roads, footpaths, stormwater and the like. Because I do just think it is a bit fraught with danger if you don't maintain that investment, because if you don't do it for 1 year, does that then snowball into future years? So But in saying that, again, that's investment in replacement renewal is very much informed by service levels relative to, well, what's the service intervention for resealing roads, for example. So
with the updating of the asset management plans, and this is probably a question to you, Sam, any sort of intelligence around what we're likely to be presented with as we go through that process? Because clearly we have to do that, and we have to, you know, we should be maintaining our existing assets to a certain level. So what's your thoughts on that?
The asset management plan drafts as presented really reflect what we currently allocate in our long-term infrastructure asset management plans. We've done a fair bit of work in terms of condition assessments and modelling in that space across our major asset categories. There's always room for improved maturity. The audits that we undertook through internal audit identified there's some opportunities for improvement, and we're working in that space. But if by and large we've got enough funds allocated to support renewal, the only caveat is obviously this really unusual peak in unit price that we mentioned earlier, and what impact that might have in future. So it may become more costly to maintain the same service level, and that's what it's predicated on. We're maintaining the service level as it is across these major infrastructure classes, because quite frankly, I don't think we can afford to drop them. I think we are at the point where it's providing the service level is fair, and I just don't think there's a lot of room. When we've done the modelling, we presented this information previously to councils, particularly as it relates to our biggest asset, roads. If you don't invest in for a year or two, it quickly drops the overall condition of the network, and that's where you're pretty much stuck at.
Any thoughts from the independent members at this stage? Just you've got control of your mic, so yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just had a question, delivering off Paul's question, I think, is so what between the two models that we're looking at, I'm just not clear about what is not going to get funded with version 2 as opposed to version 1. Okay, the renewal is going to be maintained, that's good, but obviously there's some projects that are.
So thank you. So I'll jump in here. So we have got a slide. I'll just jump on that slide, and it's going to show what's the variance between the two scenarios. So this slide tells us that where the investment is more and less. So if you see here on the new capital grants, which is this line item, capital expenditure for new and upgrade from 2022 to 2030-31. If we go with scenario 1, we're going to be spending 76.587 million. Whereas if we go with scenario 2, which is 62.715. So that's like a 13.8 million less capital expenditure on the new assets. Whereas if you see the capital expenditure on replacement and renewal, so these are to keep the existing assets up to a state where they are performing good. So that's about 31.7 million. So in both the scenarios, we haven't touched that. Same with our income. We haven't touched our income in both the scenarios, not even our employee cost, not even our contract and material. The finance cost, which is clearly dependent on the borrowings, is different in both the scenarios. And if you see the debt balance as of 30th of June, based on both the scenarios, 26.67 million in scenario 1 and 11.7 million in scenario 2.
That's over 10 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think my question was more about what is the council not going to get for its money? You know, drilling down a little bit. Yeah, I mean, there are some key projects that are not getting done in that 13 million, $40 million of savings, or are they roads? Are they, you know, major projects we've been talking about, or what?
So that is the reduction in the discretionary funding. So in one model, 3 million is set aside towards the discretionary funding where council can use the money for anything. capital. Whereas the other model, scenario 2, is based on 1.5 million only, so a reduction of 1.5 million in discretionary capital funding. So it can be like, any of the projects. I mean, it's almost like in the longer term, what does council want? Does it want debt reduction, but still deliver on big projects? Or, like every year they can put 3 million towards discretionary capital funding. And yeah. And I mean, like, even with the 1.5 million discretionary funding, the position that council will use that money towards is matching the funding, so that when 1.5 million becomes 3 million with other funding opportunities.
Lakesh, is that the same figure that we had pre-COVID? That discretionary capital? Was it the same? Is it the same?
I can most probably answer that, Mayor. Yeah, yes, the scenario 1 is predicated pretty much on having that same discretionary funding that we had, yes, which is an index of 3 mil. Well, scenario 2 is where we're reducing that to 1.5. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, correct.
Natalie, have you got any comments at this stage? No? Okay. Any other comments at this stage from elected members? Okay, keep going, guys.
If we just go back a few slides, just back to where. Yes, one of the other things I wanted to just touch on before we sort of further drill down with each scenario is wanted to indicate from a operating position as well in the statement of comprehensive income, there is a sizable impact on depreciation through the value of assets we receive each year from developers. And what we've done in the model, Mayor, is that based on a very sizable piece of work done through Sam's team with discussions with various developers in the town, we've modelled out over the next 10 years what the likely rates of development will be in terms of new allotments coming on board. And whilst it's widely recognised externally that with the development growth comes new rates, which is great, but also comes new costs in terms of maintenance costs for that infrastructure. But with the rate of growth that we're getting, I just wanted to flag there is a material impact on depreciation, because as soon as we take those assets on board, we not only have to maintain them, but we also have to depreciate them.
Renewal, that's saying we build the swimming pool, is that what that is?
Yes.
29?
Same.
Yes, that's the new and upgrade expenditure over 27, 28, 28, 29. So that's why, yeah, that's a spike in that year, yes.
Yeah, you're talking about the new assets coming from developers. Have you also included, say, the new shopping centre up at Springwood? Because that's going to be a windfall, isn't it, Ruben?
Yes. Look, I've had discussions with internally with planning staff on that matter, because I was conscious, obviously being a Gawler East resident myself, seeing that the progress that was happening. Conservatively, though, I've factored that in there from 23, 24, not 22, 23. The timing might, because we obviously set the budget and rates indicatively end of June next year, and the intel I've got through planning staff is that it'll be very borderline in terms of whether that project's a not only finished but B, also that the valuer general has gone in and done a revaluation. So conservatively, I've modelled that in because yes, you're right, that will have a sizable impact. I think of about 0.2 or 0.3% in rate revenue on its own, but conservatively allowed for that from 23-24, not 22-23.
I think that's a great explanation of how new commercial developments come online. Yeah.
And Mayor, just on that point, I can recall back when Gawler Green came on board, Coles and Hungry Jack's on their own, that whole was 1% general rate increase, and just because of the massive valuations. So yes, there is a significant impact rating wise from that.
Got a sore throat. It's not COVID. Just on that, Paul, nice to see you back, by the way. Really good. You touched on about rates, and you downplayed it. Where do we get our good income from then?
Jim, well, that's a pretty easy question to answer in that traditionally in local government, general rates is where we get the lion's share of our income. And for us, that's about 70%, which is Mayor, on average with most other councils. Yes, there's a certain element of grant funding, which amounts to about 10%. And they're recurrent grants, not capital grants. So that's your library operating grant, your financial assistance grant and the like. But you remove those two, Mayor, and there's very little left because a lot of the user charges we get from the likes of the swimming pool or the rec centre, they're heavily subsidised by general rates. And so, Jim, in answer to your question, it's general rates. That's our bread and butter income.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Well, what strategy have we got? As I've spoken to Henry a couple of times about developing the town a bit better, getting the developers to do that. What's the strategy for the long-term future then? Because and it is good to have rates, more rates coming in and more developers, because I've heard of people say that developers are greedy, and I'm a developer myself, and that really upsets me when I hear things like that. So what's the real truth?
Well, I think to sort of answer your question there, Jim, the real truth, so to speak, is I think what gets lost with the average punter is that, yes, there's widely accepted that with new development comes new rates, but what the average punter doesn't realise is the new costs that come on board. Because with all those, with all the new developments, Mayor, there's street lighting, waste, footpaths, reserves that have to be maintained. And I think that's what a lot of people don't necessarily fully appreciate is the level of cost and depreciation alone. And I know Henry said this many times that residential land developments aren't seen to be a sort of cash cow for councils, is really sort of a break even at best. So, but again, that really comes back to your service levels. And I know Mayor and members will recall in recent years, or 3-4 years ago, we had that extensive conversation about service levels with new reserves with developers. And that was a sort of timely conversation that we had because the financial consequences on that is quite substantial.
Well then, Paul, what would you like to see?
Well, Jim, I don't think it's necessarily a case of what I would like to see. I'm obviously here acting on behalf of the elected member body, but I guess professionally, my professional opinion would be, and it's no different to what the sort of industry view is through the LGA, is having, in the longer term, having a council that's financially sustainable. And that's essentially represented by having a sustainable operating result. Now, it's widely accepted, Mayor, for major growth councils like us, there may be instances where we have to have short-term deficits. But the key thing is, if that scenario plays out, the key thing is you've got to have a longer-term plan to get back to surplus. And also the other key thing, I guess I would like to see from a professional point of view, and what we've done the modelling on, is the other key indicator is our net financial liabilities ratio, which is heavily informed by debt. So the industry position is generally accepted that the ratio not exceed 100%. So it means your total liabilities aren't exceeding your total operating revenue. And that's a broadly accepted industry position. Now, as you would have seen from the two different scenarios, that those ratio outcomes do differ between the two scenarios. And historically, for us here, specifically on the net financial liabilities ratio, as Paul Kosh mentioned when we were standing up the back, Mayor, and you would recall it in your time here, in 2009 we had a liabilities ratio, I think, of 86%, and we made the conscious decision. It was actually a recommendation through the audit committee at the time to get that debt down, get us into a sustainable position. So I think in about 4 years, that ratio result was cut in half. So we materially got our debt down. And Mayor, as we've reported many times, if we hadn't done that, the capacity for us to build this beautiful building, we wouldn't have had it. And as you touched on, Councillor Kosh, there can quite often be that sort of cyclic effect where, and that's what sort of, as you've seen from the graphs, is what we're sort of really predicating the models on, in that building sufficient capacity to do that next iconic project. So, Jim, in a long-winded way, the two key things I'd like to see is a sustainable operating result, a sustainable liabilities ratio, and I guess the key third thing is the asset sustainability ratio. And they're the three key statutory ratios. If you look after them, Mayor, the budget tends to look after itself.
What, with the new government reforms and the legislative reforms requiring a 3-year report on budgets, and which is a sort of a backdoor rate capping exercise, what are your thoughts on how we'll fare as a growth council?
Look, Mayor, at this stage, obviously we don't know which year in that cycle will be subject to scrutiny, but I would like to think a fair-minded independent person from Escosa, who I believe would be doing that piece of work, that I feel relatively comfortable in terms of the level of analysis and modelling we do, that our numbers, our modelling is sound. So yeah, look, whilst it's, as you say, it's another legislative tool that's been thrown upon us, which we'll obviously have to comply with. I'm not sure when, whether it'll be in which year it will land for us. All I do know, Mayor, is it's going to be a sizable piece of work to comply with, but I'm confident that going through that process, yeah, we would tick all the boxes.
Unfortunately for Barossa, we're a very small area, but we also don't have a lot of industrial, and that's where the big rates come from, the industrial. If you go out to Edinburgh and you see what, to Edinburgh out there, and you see what Salisbury's got, it's massive what they've got. The Barossa has huge industrial, so, their rates, they can probably bring the dollar down in their rate because of all that they've got coming in.
members. So we'll then just talk you through a bit more with each scenario. So the slide up on the screen just gives a bit of a snapshot with scenario 1. So as we've touched on, this is the scenario with considerably increased discretionary capital expenditure, indexed at $3 million per annum from 23-24. Again, both models are predicated on a 2.5% general rate increase from existing ratepayers. And Mayor, later on in the session, I've got one alternate proposal that members might wish to consider in that regard. And with the scenario 1, we're looking at, due to that increased discretionary capital investment, we are looking at the model suggests deficits for 7 out of the next 10 years, and your projected loan balance, 31 of just under 27 mil. So if we then go to the next slide. So this slide then, members, illustrates that sort of graphically. So you can see with the operating surplus deficit result, green being a surplus position, red being deficit, and the graph at the bottom with the blue line is indicating the sort of indicative movement in the loan balance, the debt balance as informed by the level of capital investment. And you can clearly see from there is the spike in 27-28 and 28-29, purely because of that next iconic asset investment. And then with scenario 2, so this model is predicated on that considerably reduced discretionary capital investment, indexed at 1.5 from 2024-25, and that model indicates that there would be deficits for three of the 10 years, and a significantly reduced debt balance at 30 June 2031 of 11.7 mil. Now, I guess I need to stress, members, that with any long-term financial plan, it's purely just a model based on various key assumptions, and so these numbers aren't, so obviously the further out you get, are certainly not set in concrete. It's really just designed as a bit of a financial roadmap, but in terms of what the outcomes would be based on various scenarios, whether it be level of capital investment and the like. Then on the next slide with the graphs, scenario 2, you'll see with the operating surplus position, yes, for the next 10 years, only 3 years of deficits instead of 7. And you'll see obviously the consequences of the reduced capital investment, the impact that has on our loan balance. But again, noting that spike in 27-28 and 28-29. Then, as Lakesh referenced before, the slide we've put up here is purely just to demonstrate the difference between the two scenarios, and it really is, as we've touched on, the only difference is the discretionary capital investment, which then influences the borrowing costs, i.e. the finance costs, and depreciation. So those two key variables, and the difference over the 10 years is that the indicative debt balances at 30 June 31, the difference between the two scenarios would be the bottom right-hand corner of essentially a difference in the order of $15 million of debt in the two scenarios. Any questions at this junction?
Good. I might just get Sam, I don't want to put Sam on the hot seat, but as we've been preparing the scenarios and having the internal conversations and talking about the reduced new capital, you know, Sam certainly put up the red flag in regards to there's a lot of good work that should otherwise be done, we have been doing, and you know, what that might mean at an operational level and or a service delivery level. So Sam, would you just sort of talk about your observations in that regard relative to, you know, the discipline that we would otherwise need and understanding about not providing the level of service that we have been over the last couple of years.
Thank you, Henry. There's a number of different, I mean, generally we've allocated $3 million plus in new capital, and it's been a very difficult decisions each year in terms of what's allocated. In terms of reducing that down to $1 to $2 million in that sort of order, we're not going to have the ability or flexibility to be able to say do a $750,000 car park upgrade at the Quarter Oval, for instance, as a new and when you consider that that's half of the available funding. It's not going to give us the ability and flexibility to be able to go for grant funding for projects like the modular change rooms and the netball courts that are a $6 million project. $3 million of that's our funding. So it's going to make it difficult. And one of the scenarios that's not presented here, which we debated internally, was that whether not necessarily have these two peaks and these, you know, as one scenario, the Twin Towers versus the, you know, a very versus the other option, which is something to maintain status quo, was to effectively reduce the peaks and actually be able to attack each of those strategic projects that we have across the town in bite-sized pieces. It just means that effectively we wouldn't be able to deliver on that that pool project or Carvetham Reserve, or what it is the members wanted to do as an iconic project in year 27 to 29. So that is another option. It does allow more flexibility, but in some respects, but it removes flexibility on this iconic project.
Look, I appreciate what Sam was saying, but for me, to reduce your new capital expenditure by 1.5 million a year, I think that's not much really to pay to have all that saving and to get the iconic project. For me, that's how I feel. I think we've promised the community we're going to upgrade the pool so many times, and I think it's 1.5 million. I think that's not too much to ask.
I think planning for upgrade of the pool, we either shut the pool or we upgrade it. Unley tried to shut their pool. In fact, they did. There was a huge public outcry and ended up spending and putting in a whole new facility. So it didn't work. So shutting it, taking away a facility that's needed for the community and for the region is an interesting one. We've got a 60-year-old pool, and it's probably going to last another 10 years. It's cement. It's going to perish at some point. So we know that. We do know that. And that's part of that sort of process of upgrading, whatever that might look like. So it might be a revised upgrade. And $1.5 million is a tough call, but that's new. That's not recurrent. And I hear what you're saying, Sam, but there has to be a disciplined approach, because otherwise you're not going to reach. We've got that much pressure on our sport and rec, because we don't get a lot of funding from state and federal. We miss out big time, in my humble view. We do need millions of dollars externally. How we go about getting that is not easy. It's getting harder and harder. But we do have costings around how we can ask for that, but we probably need to match it. That'll be our challenge. And that will come from borrowings, more than likely. So we either have no room to move on our borrowings and just keep business as usual and never do up our, but we're going to get to a point where we'll have no choice. And then we'll be in a really sticky position, because we'll still have to take out borrowings to actually fix up things. And I just think that's a bad position rather than planning and having capacity. In my view, it would be far better to have capacity, to have a bit more control over what you want to do, rather than being forced into a situation and not being able to afford it. So, I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? You know, because each year we'll have pressure on us to spend more. You're absolutely right, Sam. And how we go about that is going to be an interesting one. Cody?
Just a question about, I guess, how we arrived at this scenario to, like, why specifically, you know, 1.5? Like, if there was a scenario where it said 1 million, would that be something that would, you know, reduction rather than 1.5, would that be something that would delay the pool, for example? Like, is just curious about, I guess, the gradations along the way that got us from scenario 1 to 2.
Yes, look, we can do all sorts of different models based on different levels of capital investment. I guess what we've endeavoured to demonstrate here, Mayor, is really just the differences between two scenarios, the sort of continuing as is with the discretionary 3 mil compared to an indicative 1.5 discretionary mil, and then what the impact of that is over 10 years. But Mayor, I did particularly like one key word you said just then, and that's discipline, because I noted that in the last, I think, last 5-6 years, we've averaged new and upgraded capital investment in the order of 5 to 6 million each year on average, and that's excluding this building, because this was sort of a unique project. So to go from that sort of trend to then suddenly 1.5 over 10 years, do the maths, it's clearly going to require considerable discipline. And yeah, I just flagged that this is really just a roadmap, a financial roadmap of where you can get to and how to get there. It's ultimately up to council whether they want us to look at sort of alternate models, which we can do relatively easily.
The 1.5 million is not actually set in concrete. It's an aspiration. It'd be better to get more than that. So something might come up where you have to spend a little bit more, but then the next year, hopefully you'll be able to, you know, pick up what you didn't spend. So it is you know, it's a floating thing. It's not set in concrete, but we won't get anywhere if we keep spending. And I think, you know, especially the last couple of years with COVID and the money that we've spent, I think the community has you know, achieved, well, we have achieved so much for the community that people, it's a different town to what it was a few years ago. If you drive around and see what's been done and what hasn't been done, it's a completely different town. And I think as long as we can keep up our beautification plan, the community will see that we're still doing stuff and making stuff better, and they probably won't even notice that we're not spending big money somewhere else.
Any other comments, Peter?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I just thought I'd make a couple of comments as from, I guess, my background as an accountant and an economist, both boring and miserable.
That's why you're here, Peter.
That's right. But I do see the importance, having worked in local government for a long, long time, and now retired, but mainly, but local government does play a very important part in local communities, and I think it's generally underrated by the community. That's my view. But local government does do things, and what you see on the boards there is a whole lot of really good things that, you know, the council wants to do as an aspiration. What it comes down to is being able to afford it at the end of the day. And I think the staff have done a really good job in terms of the preparations there, and also the plan. I think it's been brilliant. And in reality, my concerns are around the string of deficits that occur. But they're not too bad individually, but they mount up. And the other one is debt, which is sort of right up there, particularly on option 1. But option 1 is what you really want to go for, because I also think that what we have presented in the budget is what we can see now, and what happens in reality as you get down the track. There are more things that we want. We have to spend more money on. Want to spend more money on those other things, and I think some of them have been mentioned already. So in reality, the loss of that $1.5 million, by going to option 2, may not be, you may find yourself being pushed to go back and grab that money, because there are a number of risks out there. Climate change adjustments is one. Growth may taper off in terms of development. Growth may not be there as much as we anticipated. Government grants might reduce because governments all over the world are spending money left, right and centre, but there's going to come a time when that back. Interest rates are likely to rise over the term, who knows by how much. So we always underestimate the future needs in our longer term planning. 10 years is a really long time to try and forecast things. So I guess the point I'm coming back to is we look at all these things, all the elements that make up the bag of tricks that we can pull, the levers that we can pull in order to achieve what we want to achieve. But the one we have a blind eye on, I think, is rate increases. And it's not a popular thing, I know, but I want to raise it. I feel I should raise it, because I don't think, while people do complain about rates, I can remember when I was working, we actually had a period where the state government imposed amalgamations and rate capping, and the only way you could get out of rate capping is if you went to the people and got a vote that allowed you to be exempted from the rate capping. And we did that, and we put up to the community the consequences of if we couldn't increase the rates versus the lower rates. And the vote came back in favour of, we were happy to pay a bit more in rates, modest, but a bit more, and so we were allowed to be exempted from the rate capping, and we were able to lift our rates. So I don't think people are absolutely against rate increases if they can see the benefits of what they're now, I'm not suggesting you go to a vote of the community for that sort of thing, but it may be that some of these if the community wants these iconic projects, I don't know whether you've done a lot of community consultation about that, and whether the community is prepared to pay an extra supplement on top of their rate increases. Some councils have used this strategy to say we'll increase the rates by 1%, which would generate to you another $260,000 every year. You can sell that benefit to them as this is what they're going to get, fantastic new park and swimming pool and so on, and people will say, yeah, we want that in our community. Everybody's saying that. So are they prepared to pay what amounts to probably 4 cups of coffee in a year to get that additional benefit? So I guess all I'm saying is don't close off that option. And consider that as a strategy.
As I said before, though, we don't have a lot of industrial land, and our rate in the dollar is quite high compared to the surrounding councils. So when we set the rates, we're always compared to Barossa and Lights, and we've got lots of land, and they keep knocking us all the time. Then our residents pick up on, so they're not happy with the fact that our rate in the dollar is high. So we've always got that coming to matters.
Yeah, but I think the issue is not the rate in the dollar. I mean, people look at that, so they see your rate in the dollar is higher, and if I had my house here, then I'd pay more. but the average residential rate, how much higher than some of these other councils is that? That's the more important measure.
Peter, the comment you made there is, if I can use that, Mayor, as a bit of a segue in terms of an alternate position with general rate increase that I did purely just to see what the impact would be, because, but just to answer, Di, your question with the rate and the dollar, yes, I know certain people out there sort of get fixated with that, but you need to bear in mind straight away, I think certainly Barossa and a few other councils are joining us have what's called a fixed charge. And so any council that has a fixed charge as part of their rate in the dollar. So for example, I think Barossa have a sizable fixed charge, and it means any council that has a fixed charge as part of their general rate, it automatically means their rate in the dollar is going to be materially down, because that fixed charge is applied before consideration of the rate in the dollar. So it does mean you can't compare apples with apples with a council that's got a fixed charge and one that hasn't. And the councils that do have a fixed charge, sometimes they sell themselves saying, oh, look at us, our rate in the dollar is as low as it is. And I think, Mayor, Clayford or Salisbury have a very low residential rate in the dollar, but that's because they have a very high fixed charge. So as Peter rightly says, it comes down to comparing your average residential rates, which is informed by the valuations, because they'll fluctuate from town to town. And Mayor, we've done that analysis historically, and when you look at the true comparisons, we're not that dissimilar to other councils. Yes, we're most probably in the higher context, but we're not out there on our own. So we're quite comparable.
Paul, could you just remind me, I've forgotten, a 1% rise, how much is that in revenue again?
1% from in terms of net general rates is about 220,000. So to get to what? Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
From my point of view, I was just suggesting increasing the operating revenue or reducing the deficit, so you have more funds to service the debt that you might have with that $1.5 million.
I understand what you're saying, Paul, because you explain it to us every year. It's just getting it out there for the community so that they understand it. That's getting the message across. And for example, you know, if you lived at Walkerville, your rate in the dollar might be down, but your value of your property is so much more. So therefore, they're getting more rates.
Walkerville don't really have much to spend their money on. Yeah, they're very lucky. Yes, yes. No. Growth councils have unique challenges. Yeah. Okay. Want to keep going, Paul?
Mayor, so further to what Peter had said, one sort of model I just wanted to, I guess, put out there for members to contemplate is that being mindful of the fact that with scenario 2, we're still having that 3 years of deficits, bearing in mind that one-off sort of spike with 23, 24. But one option I just thought council might wish to consider is, in touching on your point, Peter, in terms of the next iconic asset, Mayor, I was thinking along the lines of yes, maintaining the 2.5% increase, but then applying an additional 0.25% for 5 years as with the message being to the community that this additional 0.25 is predicated on the fact that we're wanting to accumulate revenue towards our next iconic project. So I think, Peter, as you touched on, I was of the view that under that scenario, I wouldn't be necessarily suggesting going to the community saying, oh, we've got a 2.75% increase. I'd be saying 2.5% plus a 0.25% specifically towards the next iconic project, and whether that might.
So when would you, what are you recommending from when?
Well, it was just one model I did from 22-23 for 5 years, leading up to when we would be indicatively doing that next iconic project at the pool, and having a additional 0.25% of general rates applied towards that project. Because I guess at the end of the day, members, as in one of the final slides, we're saying ultimately each year you need to determine what the appropriate funding mix is between general rates and loan borrowings. And that comes back to existing ratepayers versus future ratepayers and what that mix is. But I just wanted to sort of flag that as a possible notion for council to consider.
What would the average cost, extra cost be, the average per household at that, the extra 2.5?
Well, I guess, Di, doing the quick maths, I think this year when we had the 2.5% increase, we were couching that as I think a $40 average increase for the average residential ratepayer. So it would be pretty marginal.
Is that scenario 2.5% or 0.25%? That's only $50,000 a year.
Yes, yes, I recognise that, but I guess the key thing is that's then compounded over the 10 years.
The 10 years.
Sorry, over the 5 years. And
okay. It's 250 just as a flat thing, and then you got to compound it. That'd only be $300,000, wouldn't it? Oh yeah. I know.
So yes, I acknowledge, Paul. Looking at 1 year in isolation, it doesn't seem material, but it does certainly considerably improve the situation when it's compounded over 10 years.
What would it be after the 10 years, roughly? Have you got the figure there? I can't do it.
Yes, you're correct. But that does have I guess, compounding effect over 10 years. But yes, I'm only proposing for 5 years to have 0.25%. Then,
so would you be putting that into normal revenue, or would you just setting it aside? How would you manage that number? How would you use that cash?
Look, I wouldn't necessarily be setting it aside, but I think the important message would be that council, in turning its mind to how we're going to fund the next iconic project, it has to be a combination of debt and rates, and I'm really just flagging it as something for council to consider.
Yeah, look, I think it's something interesting to consider. I think, as Councillor Fraser's been saying, a lot of it's not to do with, a lot of it's to do with, I guess, whether people feel like they're getting their money's worth. And, if you can actually communicate properly, because if you tell them the rates are going up, they're going to say, but if you say, well, here's a little rate for, we need to upgrade the pool, I think that's something that's much more concrete. So I think that kind of thing might be a good form of communication.
Phrase.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, can you remind me how the Barossa Council funded the Rex? Was that a special rate?
That was a special rate, a separate rate.
So I know a lot of people in Linddock were pretty upset about it because they didn't go up there and whatever, but yeah.
Yes, I can recall that because I was there at the time, and I can recall, there was a bit of angst in terms of people in the southern Barossa saying, oh, well, we'll never use the Rex. but my recollection was they did apply a separate rate for a period of time, which Mayor, I guess really, in reality, isn't really fundamentally different to what I'm sort of proposing as an alternate option, because I was just proposing instead of a separate rate, just adding a little bit extra to the general rate, but the key message being that additional 0.25% would be towards the next iconic project. Look, Paul, it was 12 years ago, so yeah, I couldn't remember. But I do know it was fairly sizable dollars that they were generating. Yeah.
Have you got any other comments? How are we going with the presentation, guys? Do you want to keep moving? Any other comments, elected members? Oh, Natalie?
I just want to make one comment to make sure that I haven't missed something. But I mean, what's happening in the US tonight is that there's a risk that we're going to have, increase in inflation and the cost of living. And then to counteract that, they're going to have to increase interest rates to bring down inflation. Has that been sort of worked into the model? Because the increase in your rates, that'll be your CPI will go up, so therefore the increase in the rates won't be as effective as it has been previously because they've had low CPI. And then, borrowings are impacted because we've got the borrowings that are variable with a variable interest rate. The question is, have you factored that into the model?
Yeah, Mayor, what we've done with the model, there is a very nominal contingency, and I stress nominal, for increase in interest rates. However, anecdotally, what's generally happened is that if interest rates have increased, then invariably, yes, there'll be a sort of adjustment with CPI as well. And whilst I know from an industry perspective, we don't use CPI for setting rates, but a lot of people out there, that's what they use. And the 2.5% increase we're flagging, members, is sort of generally aligned with a sort of inflationary CPI contingency. So, Natalie, we're of the view that if interest rates were to materially increase, then there'd be the expectation that CPI would go up, and then there would be the potential expectation that the rate increase would go up consistent with that as well. So that, but we have allowed a nominal provision for increase in interest rate above what they are at the moment.
Yeah, that's where I like the scenario 2 and being disciplined, as you picked up before, is that I think the council has to be disciplined because there's so many variables, as Peter said, there's so many variables coming up over the next 10 years that, some years will probably do better than others, but I think if you sort of have that theme, then, you sort of give yourself the best opportunity for success.
And Mayor, in that regard, I think too, it's important to reference the fact, I think from the previous audit committee, Peter Barossa was certainly championing the notion of the net financial liabilities ratio. Is it still appropriate to have that target between 0 to 100, which is very broad? And now that's a broadly accepted industry position that was structured 10, 15 years ago. Now, as an administration, I guess we'll need to turn our mind to that from a policy position. But I have always advocated that we need to keep that ratio result suitably below 100% just for any unforeseen scenario. And Mayor, we've had that, I think 2016 with the floods, where we had to have sizable investment in road renewal. And who's to say in certain years there may be circumstances unforeseen that we need to urgently borrow. So I do think it is important to have that sort of nominal borrowing capacity.
And I think that goes back to your point, Guy, about just having that flexibility. So some years we'll go above, we need to draw down, and other years we can pay back. So, but we do need a bit more flexibility than what we currently have. And I think we need to, again, be disciplined. And, you know, picking up on Sam's point about, you know, raising red flags and, you know, there's lots of desires and, you know, if you look at the graph, we're foregoing 13.8 million over that 10-year period because, you know, we're going to be cutting back our discretionary capital. So I think we need to understand that, be prepared to, we may not reach that 13.8 saving, but we might get close to it. If we can get close to it, it gives us lots of capacity because if rates go up, if inflation rises, rates go up, etc., because that will come, everyone's predicting that, and the US tend to lead the pack, don't they? So we do need to be mindful. Material increase in costs, that's not going to change. That'll be a reality of, you know, how much that material increase is. We need flexibility. So again, we need to be disciplined. So my view is we should be very mindful of our debt balance and keep that so that we have got some flexibility. You know, if we have a major flood, we'll need to spend another $500,000, whatever it might be. So yeah, could be more than that. I don't know. We'll rely on Sam's expertise to tell us. But yeah, but the other thing is our financial, our ratios will be critical. If we can keep them under control, I think we'll be a lot better. You know, back in 2010, you know, our asset sustainability was appalling and our financial liability was appalling as well. So we were sort of not really delivering on anything, but we got there and we were disciplined. Yeah, so we will have a lot of pressures and lots of temptations to, you know, tempt us as growth council. So I don't know. It's a good discussion to have, and they're model. These are aspirational targets, and they're modelling exercises, which are always fraught with danger. But we have to do them so that we can plan.
So moving on from there, we have got, you must have seen in both the scenarios, scenario 1 and scenario 2, we have captured participatory budgeting and council 1% member bids. And they both would be funding within the existing budget. So there isn't any further loan borrowings or increasing loan in that regard. So that's been factored in. So with just to remind everyone, with participatory budgeting, what are the key dates and highlights of the program? So we're going to be keeping $40,000 allocated for a community say. In the next rates notices, we would be putting a leaflet informing about participatory budgeting to the community because it's a new initiative. So just giving a bit of information, some important timelines. It's going to begin in February, March. Nomination forms for the project would be available online, and even like the hard copies would be available. And then there would be a voting period for 2 events. So that's how the participatory budgeting is going to flow. So around July 2022-23, the successful projects would be announced. And in regards to 22-23 budgeting, the major thing is like setting aside $40,000 and then working through this process from start to finish. Any questions on participatory budgeting? We have been talking about this in the last few meetings. Then the next slide talks about council members bid process and timelines. So 15th of December. So a template would be provided to the elected members for filling in. So this is almost like last year's template. You guys can put in your projects, what you think, and then you can submit it to us by 17th of January. And then from 17th January to 2nd of February, the management will collate all the proposals, determine whether the bid is operational or capital, and present it on the workshop, on the second workshop of 2nd February.
Can we have that slide circulated to all elected members and also put it up on the hub so people can access and find out and understand the dates?
Okay. So that's, And then the second workshop is on the 2nd of February, where all the bids would be discussed. We will also be presenting a recurrent budget in that workshop. On 15th of March, there is a special council meeting at which council will deliberate on the draft budget. And 5th of April, the bids will be incorporated and presented in the annual business plan. So that's like the process in regards to council member bids. So as Mayor has said, we'll put it on the hub as well. And the form will be circulated before close of this week. Debt management. So I think I'll give it to Paul now. Paul can talk about debt management.
Yes, members, I guess the key thing I see with debt, obviously that's a key point of interest for elected members. I've just provided a bit of a snapshot relative to our sort of debt management strategy approach. And we do have 4 historic fixed interest rate loans that were taken out between 2007-8 and 2010-11. And as noted on that slide here, those interest rates which were fixed for the life of the loan, one of them's as high as 7.88%. And noting that those loans will be fully repaid by 25-26. So what we've done since 2010-11, and this has been a very prudent approach that saved us a considerable amount of interest expense, is that since then all our borrowings, as we've needed them, has been through what we call the variable interest, or what's called cash advance debentures, which is essentially an overdraft. Mayor, and the important thing is that we can repay that variable interest debt at any time as cash flow permits. So it means that with the fixed interest loans, they've got half-yearly fixed principal and interest repayments, whereas the variable interest, the overdraft loans, we only draw down on that as we need it. And so it means that during periods of peak cash inflows, obviously the 4 quarterly rate cycles, we can materially reduce that debt in the short term. So that means the debt level will fluctuate dramatically during the year. But that has been a strategic move to materially reduce our interest costs for council. We do have a policy position of having a bit of a mix of debt between fixed interest and variable interest, and but noting that at the moment, Mayor and members, traditionally in recent times, the fixed interest rate has actually been higher than the variable interest rate. So I'd advocate on that basis, there's no real financial incentive to actually transition a chunk of debt from variable to fixed. You'd only really look at doing that if interest rates were sort of to materially rise in a short space of time. So I just wanted to indicate historically what that approach has been. And the other key part of that has been that, and it's enshrined in our treasury management policy, is that we don't do what's colloquially called as shoebox accounting. We have a treasury management approach where we don't separately park funds in a separate bank account, earning a very poor rate of interest. That doesn't make any financial sense when you've got elsewhere a sizable debt that you can repay. So that has meant that certainly for quite a number of years, we've never been in a position to have actually investments for the LGFA. It's always been a case of minimising that debt balance, so that we're not in the situation that some councils are in, where they have a material investment amount earning a very little rate of return compared to a debt. So it just doesn't make sort of financial sense. Just do the next slide. Yes.
So just a question. So with the interest rates, which I guess we've, you know, heard are likely to go back up soon. Are we holding ourselves back financially by sticking to this 100% debt ratio? Like if we invested in a bunch of debts now, basically, would we be financially better off than if we did it in 3 years? I'm just wondering if you've got any sort of figures on that kind of sort of that sort of thing.
Look, interesting question, but I guess my immediate thought would be I'd always be continuing to advocate to be maintaining within that policy ratio of 100%. And because I know there's, Mayor, I think there's only 2 or 3 councils that are over 100%. Playford's the key one, who does have a very high debt. And yes, there is an argument to be had that whilst interest rates are low, to take advantage of that. But at the end of the day, we do have those 3 key statutory ratios, and I would continue to advocate operating within those policy positions. So I professionally wouldn't be proposing to suggesting to council to because the interest rates being as low as they are, to suddenly go out and borrow X million dollars now for an iconic project, because our debt's already fairly sizable as it is, as is reflected in our liabilities ratio. So I would still advocate operating within those policy thresholds. Continue. The relative to the final few slides is really just giving a few key messages and also the activities currently underway. So this is very much the first workshop of a series of workshop members, followed by subsequent special council meetings. Obviously, this is the 4th year of your cycle, so you're getting used to the process. So this is very much the start of the journey that we'll be repeating. But clearly, there's a sizable amount of work that needs to occur in terms of the update, of the ongoing update and refinement of the long-term financial plan, asset management plans, and development of budget bids and the current budget, which will obviously, from an administration perspective, continue over coming months, leading up to the next workshop, which I think is, Mayor, in early Feb.
Dates, I think, have been put in our diaries. I think
yes,
that's right. Yep.
And on the last slide, Mayor, we do reference those dates.
Okay.
Need to go to the next slide. So I guess to sort of sum up, Mayor, in terms of what we see as being the key messages, and really each council does have numerous challenges, but I think, Mayor, it's safe to say for growth councils, we just have materially more challenges, favourably and otherwise, that need to consider, and there's obviously risks and opportunities with that. But what we've recognised on that slide, members, is that we are one of the fastest growing councils in the state, which we've recognised does bring opportunities and financial risks with it. There's the impact now of the sector-wide changes to the Acts under the Local Government Reform Bill. Boundary reform, so just to be clear, in terms of the long-term financial plan, that only provides for the 250,000 that we've got for the inquiry. It's not forecasting anything else in that context. Yes, as Natalie, as you referred to, there is a sort of a potential interest rate risk that needs to be managed, and also consideration of success rate of grant funding, whether that will continue or not. And as we've touched on, members may need to give consideration in terms of what the future increases in general rate revenue will be. Now, to be clear, the 2.5% we've been referencing is solely for existing ratepayers, and under the modelling we've done, Mayor, informed by, again, the good work that Sam and his team have done with growth modelling, is that the sort of on average, yes, the growth in general rates from new ratepayers will broadly be roughly about 2%, but some years it's slightly lower, other years slightly higher. But we've done that modelling each year based on the intel we've got internally, and generally it's safe to say, I think for about last 5-6 years, that growth rate has been consistently about 2%. Then with the next slide, again reinforcing the need for council to turn its mind to ongoing financial sustainability, which is essentially captured by the three key ratios that we get reported on, which is the operating result, our liabilities ratio, and our asset sustainability ratio. So again, emphasise the need for council to turn its mind to that. Again, referencing the point to continue that appropriate investment in the replacement and renewal of existing assets, which council, to their credit, has consistently done over the last 5-6 years, thereby avoiding a backlog of infrastructure works. And important, as you can appreciate, that each annual budget we go into, not to consider that in isolation, because we need to consider, well, what are the material financial consequences, if any, on any decisions made during that process. And the last bullet point there I've got, Mayor and members, is I think an important one with each budget is to, and this is a difficult decision for council to grapple with each year, is, well, what is an appropriate general rate revenue amount versus how much should we rely on new borrowings? And that's essentially represented by, well, how much revenue are you wanting to derive from existing ratepayers compared to future ratepayers? And what is that appropriate sort of funding mix? And then with the last slide, just move to that. Where to from here? So we've just outlined what the sort of the key dates are. So again, very much following the theme of previous years, we're a series of informal workshops to discuss predominantly the long-term financial plan tonight, but then in the next workshop, we'll be turning our mind to other elements of the budget, which will predominantly be the budget bids, and then also go through the process with the help of Peter, Natalie and Peter Brass on the audit committee, the audit and risk committee then turning their mind to providing a overview of the draft document to give feedback to elected members, and then a series of special council meetings leading up to council endorsing the budget for public consultation. Doing that 3 weeks of consultation, and then coming back with any submissions from that process to then hopefully adopt the budget on the 28th of June 2022, Mayor. So on that note, that's all from us, Mayor, but happy to answer any questions, any burning questions members may have.
Brian?
Thanks, Mayor Karen. To Paul, one gate that I've seen open for, well, the last 3 years especially, is the gate of funding and supporting events in our town. When do we as a council start to talk about, and I mean on the back board up there, when you look at the point of the Christmas carols, 37,000, that used to cost nothing. And, you know, when you start looking at the fringe costs, the Anzac Day, 20 grand, Gawler Show, 54,000. We seem to have opened the gate there. When do we as a council sit down and say, but we need to spend that money on the swimming pool, or we need to give 2 lawnmower drivers to Sam over here to clean our town up and things like that? I mean, to me, and in my observations over the last 3 years, and it's been pointed out by many people in the community, that the people that have been attending these events are not Gawler people. They're not people that have paid rates in our town and so forth. So for us to show that we are spending the money that we retain from their rates, that we are spending it in the right directions, and moving forward. But, you know, when you look at about $200,000 or $300,000 that I can show you on the backboard there and things like that, that we have opened the gate for these community organisations and so forth. And then you've got the other groups, the service clubs, the tennis clubs, and all these people, sports clubs that are struggling, and they're not coming to us and asking us for them, but we're spending these big slabs of money, like $37,000 on Christmas carols. Come on, you know, if it was country music, I might reconsider it. But basically, I just can't come to grips with how it's become to the sort of money that is going out the door. When do we talk about it?
Yes, Mayor, we would be addressing that. If not at the next workshop, I think the next workshop in February would primarily be on the budget bids. But Brian, there is always a workshop where the key focus is on the recurrent budget, and that workshop will provide the necessary documentation such that elected members can see how the budget is sort of structured and what it's informed by, such that you can, as a collective, can then make an informed decision relative to, well, where do you think the priorities lie? And clearly from the critical path documents we got on the wall there's, as we said right from the outset, that we can't afford to do everything, Mayor, on that back wall. It comes down to council ultimately determining, well, what are your priorities? And if it means, Brian, council doesn't want to spend X dollars on a certain project, they want to do it on something else, well, that's a decision for the council to make. But rest assured, there will be a further workshop at which that will be discussed.
Thank you, Brian. Any other questions at this stage? We might be all questioned out. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. Thank you, Paul and Rakesh, for your wonderful presentations and answering questions, detailed information. We will be provided with a Christmas present of critical paths, which is just fabulous over the Christmas break, isn't it? Thank you, independent members, for coming along. Natalie and Peter, very much appreciate your input and observations. Thank you. And everyone have a great evening. When's our next meeting?